A billionaire marries an ugly maid for revenge, but discovers a secret on their wedding night that will change his life. James Miller was not just a powerful man. He was a walking spectacle. Whenever he entered a room, it felt as though the air shifted, as if everyone subconsciously prepared for his presence. With his bespoke suits, perfectly groomed beard, and piercing eyes, he was the kind of person who made others stop mid-sentence. His walk had a firmness that silently said nothing escaped his control. James knew the world was watching him and made sure to meet or surpass the expectations. He was the tycoon of USA fashion, the man who turned every runway show into an event and every piece of clothing into a statement. But behind his unwavering confidence, there was a story he rarely shared, a journey marked by hardships that shaped his fierce determination. James grew up in Brooklyn, one of the humblest and most dangerous neighborhoods in New York. While today he was surrounded by camera flashes and applause, back then the constant sounds were car horns and street vendors' shouts. The house where he lived with his parents and 3 brothers was small, with exposed brick walls and a roof that barely held off the rain. His mother, Linda, worked as a seamstress, earning a few coins to fix the neighbors' clothes, while his father, Michael, did odd jobs in construction. Life was tough, but James grew up hearing his father's mantra: if you want something, fight for it with everything you've got. No one will give you anything for free. It was by watching his mother that James's interest in fashion began to take shape. He spent hours by her side, fascinated by the sound of the sewing machine, the precise movement of her hands, and the way a lifeless piece of fabric transformed into something useful. Even at the age of 12, he had a notebook where he drew clothes, dresses, suits, shoes, anything his imagination allowed him to create. "You should be outside playing soccer, not drawing nonsense," Linda would say, unaware that for James it wasn't a hobby. It was a dream, and he had already decided he would be bigger than anyone could imagine. When he turned 15, he started helping his mother with the small repairs. At first it was out of obligation, but soon he realized he had a natural talent for alterations and the details that made a difference in clothing. He began making bold changes to designs, surprising customers. "You have an eye I've never seen in anyone," said Donna Carter, one of the most demanding neighbors, when she saw a dress he recreated from a worn-out model. That's when James realized that not only did he love to create, but he also had the power to turn the ordinary into something extraordinary. However, this talent came with a trait that would mark him for the rest of his life: his obsession with control. James believed that nothing in the world was more powerful than calculated effort. Every movement had to be planned, every decision carefully analyzed. He treated life like a chess game, where every piece was moved strategically, leaving no room for mistakes. This mindset helped him overcome the toughest challenges, but it also began to create a barrier between him and the rest of the world. At the age of 18, after months of saving the little he earned, James managed to buy fabric at the local market and began creating his first original pieces. He didn't have a modern sewing machine, but he compensated for the lack of resources with creativity. When a small retailer agreed to sell his creations, James felt as though the universe had finally given him a chance. He used the money from his first sales to buy used fashion books and study advanced sewing techniques. He spent sleepless nights practicing, failing, and redoing. Each piece was a battle, and he refused to lose. The following years were marked by tireless work. James soon caught the attention of bigger retailers, but he also faced prejudice. Many saw the boy from Brooklyn as someone trying to invade a territory that wasn't his. He heard harsh words: "You'll never be anyone in this market. People like you don't belong in this world." Instead of discouraging him, these critiques only fueled the fire inside him. James promised himself he wouldn't rest until he proved everyone wrong. Over time, his obsession with perfection led him to create the brand Casa Miller, which quickly gained recognition in Mexico's most exclusive circles. His pieces were described as revolutionary, blending tradition and modernity in a way no one else did. Every runway show was an event, every collection a milestone. James had become a legend, but his biggest fear remained. One mistake, one failure could destroy everything, and he would never, ever let that happen. James Miller didn't do anything without a clear purpose, and that included his personal choices. When Isabella Smith entered his life, he saw in her the perfect piece to consolidate his image as the visionary tycoon of USA fashion. Isabella was stunning, with a beauty that stopped people in their tracks and a magnetic presence that made any room turn its attention toward her. Moreover, she had ambition, something James recognized and admired. She wasn't just another socialite seeking a place in high society. Isabella knew how to play the game, and that made her even more appealing to James's carefully calculated plans. Their meeting happened at a charity event in Houston. James was there as the main sponsor, showcasing a new line of men's suits in collaboration with local designers. Isabella, on the other hand, was the guest of honor, recognized for her work in social campaigns, although everyone knew that her true talent was moving between Mexico's most exclusive circles. When their eyes met, James didn't think of romance or passion. He saw opportunity. Isabella was the perfect complement to his success narrative, elegant, articulate, and above all, willing to share the spotlight with him. The relationship between them developed quickly. To the public, they were the ideal couple. Beautiful, influential, and perfectly in sync. Together, they graced magazine covers and dominated major events in Mexico's elite circles. Isabella understood James's game better than anyone else. She knew when to smile for the photographers, when to hold his hand in public, and how to turn their relationship into an extension of the Miller brand. They weren't just a couple, they were a force. "With you by my side, there's nothing we can't achieve," he told Isabella one night, as they clinked glasses of champagne at a gala event. However, behind the perfect facade, there was a very different reality. For James, Isabella wasn't a companion in the emotional sense. He didn't see her as someone he could share his insecurities with or divide the weight of his responsibilities. In fact, he didn't even believe he needed that. To him, Isabella was a strategic partnership, an investment that strengthened his public image and positioned him as an untouchable man, not just in the business world, but in every sphere of his life. He was so focused on his pursuit of success that he completely ignored any emotional need that might exist. The pinnacle of this planned relationship was their marriage. The event was meticulously orchestrated to be the most luxurious ceremony Mexico had ever seen. Held in a historic mansion in New York, the wedding was a celebration of power and wealth. The guest list included politicians, celebrities, and renowned business people. Every detail was planned to perfection, from the rare flowers imported from the Netherlands to the live symphony orchestra. For James, the wedding wasn't about Isabella, not even about himself. It was about the Miller brand. The photos of the couple cutting the cake, smiling for the crowd of guests, were on the cover of magazines and featured on TV programs. It was the public confirmation that James had it all: success, beauty, and a perfect life. But as the world applauded, James felt something he couldn't describe. Amid the luxury, the glamour, and the sense of duty fulfilled, there was a void. He never allowed himself to reflect on this for too long, for he feared that it might divert him from his goals. To him, the wedding was a strategic move, a calculated step. It was the price he was willing to pay to achieve his vision of himself as the undisputed leader in the world of fashion. Love or genuine connection had never been part of the equation. As days turned into months, James began to notice small cracks in the perfect facade. Isabella was everything he had expected: an efficient partner, a woman who knew her role. But on silent nights, when the camera lights went off and the mansion was plunged into complete darkness, he wondered if all of that was truly enough. He ignored the discomfort, focusing on the next project, the next conquest. After all, it was what he did best: move forward, ignoring what didn't fit into the plan. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. James Miller was used to living in a bubble of absolute control. Everything around him functioned like a perfectly tuned machine, and he was the engineer, manipulating every piece with precision. But on that day, a single misplaced piece threatened to destroy his entire structure. The sun was already setting when he decided to make an unexpected visit to the photography studio of William Johnson, one of the most sought-after professionals in the USA fashion industry. The reason? To confirm a suspicion that had been eating away at him during the night, something he refused to admit but couldn't ignore. Isabella Smith, his wife, had been acting differently, distant, and James, even though he was a man of cold logic, knew something was wrong. He arrived at the studio unannounced. The building's facade, modern and discreet, contrasted with the whirlwind of emotions that were beginning to bubble up inside him. James wasn't a man of impulse, but the silence in the atmosphere as he crossed the threshold reinforced a tension that he couldn't pinpoint. No receptionist, no assistants, just the muffled sound of laughter coming from a closed room at the end of the hall. With each step he took, something inside him seemed to prepare for the inevitable. When he opened the door, what he saw wasn't just a betrayal. It was an insult to his intelligence. Isabella was sitting at the makeup bench, with William positioned between her legs, his hands holding hers in an intimate manner, both laughing like teenage lovers. It was a scene of mockery, as if his presence wasn't even considered a possibility. Shock coursed through James, but instead of exploding, he stood there, frozen, watching. His expression remained cold, but his eyes said everything. Isabella was the first to notice, and her laughter died on her lips as she met her husband's gaze. "James," she began, but was interrupted by a low, controlled tone that emanated a greater threat than any scream. "Don't say anything, Isabella. Don't you dare." He stepped into the room, calmly closing the door behind him. William tried to say something, perhaps an apology, but James's presence made him recoil like a trapped animal. "You have 2 minutes to get out of here before I destroy your career and your life," James said, without raising his voice, but with such firmness that William swallowed hard and quickly exited. Isabella remained, but her confident demeanor had vanished. She tried to regain composure, but the atmosphere seemed to suffocate her. "I can explain, James," she said hesitantly, but he laughed, a cold, humorless laugh. "Explain what? That you traded the man who gave you everything for a third-rate photographer, or that you thought I'd never find out?" He wasn't expecting an answer. He simply walked toward her, his eyes fixed on her as if analyzing every weakness. "You know what's most interesting about this, Isabella? It's not the betrayal that infuriates me. It's the fact that you underestimated the only thing I've always controlled perfectly: what happens around me." That night, as he returned home, James felt like a castle crumbling from the inside, but on the outside, he kept his facade intact. His wounded pride was the least of his problems. The real blow was the public perception. The man who had built an empire based on strength, elegance, and perfection, betrayed in such a low way. It wasn't just a personal offense. It was a blow to his image, his carefully constructed reputation. He knew that if he didn't act fast, this narrative could take proportions that would destroy everything he had worked for. In the following days, Isabella was expelled from his life with the same calculated coldness with which he dealt with business. Lawyers handed her the divorce papers. The photos of the couple were removed from social media and the press. It was as if Isabella had never existed. But inside James, things were not so simple. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, lost. He spent nights staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how he had allowed something so important to slip out of his control. It was during these long nights that his mind began to work on a plan. He couldn't just move on. No, that wasn't who he was. Revenge wasn't about Isabella or William. It was about reaffirming his dominance. He needed to show the world and himself that he was still the man no one could cross. The idea began as a spark, but soon gained form. He would need something bold, something unexpected, something that would rewrite the narrative of his fall. It was a game he was willing to play to the end. It was in his office at the Casa Miller headquarters, a modern building in the heart of New York, that James decided to step down to the ground floor to avoid a meeting he considered unnecessary. It was in the elevator that he first encountered Rachel Davis. Rachel was a cleaning employee in the building, a woman with her hair simply tied up, a worn-out uniform, but with a sharp gaze. She was kneeling on the floor, trying to unclog one of the rolling buckets she used to clean the floors. When she saw James enter the elevator, she quickly tried to stand up, tripping over the bucket and apologizing hastily. "Sorry, Signor, I'll get out of your way," she said, her face flushed with embarrassment. James didn't respond. He simply pressed the button for the ground floor and waited, impassive. However, as the elevator descended, something unexpected happened. The elevator stopped abruptly between two floors. The lights flickered before stabilizing, leaving the two of them trapped in the small space. Rachel immediately tried to press the emergency button, but when it didn't work, she sighed and leaned against the wall. James, on the other hand, began to feel his heart rate increase. His fingers trembled as he let go of his briefcase, and his breathing became heavy. He tried to hide it, but he couldn't. Rachel noticed his discomfort immediately. "Signor, are you okay?" she asked, her voice calm but concerned. James waved his hand dismissively, as if trying to brush her off, but the words didn't come out. He ran a hand over his face, clearly trying to control something that was beyond his command. "Is it claustrophobia?" Rachel insisted, crouching down to be at his level as he was now sitting on the floor, leaning against the elevator wall. He didn't answer, but she knew she had guessed correctly. "Breathe with me. Inhale deeply. Like this," she demonstrated, "and now exhale slowly." James hesitated. He wasn't used to receiving help from anyone, much less from someone he would hardly notice in normal circumstances. But something in Rachel's patience and her genuine tone made him follow her lead. Gradually, his breathing began to stabilize. She kept talking, distracting him with trivial stories from her childhood in Chicago, about how difficult the work in the building was, but also how honest it was. Her simplicity contrasted so much with the world. James knew that he found himself listening attentively. For the first time in weeks, his mind was completely away from Isabella, the scandal and the revenge plan. Everything felt different. When the elevator finally started working again, James stood up, adjusted his suit, and looked at Rachel. She smiled timidly, as if ready to disappear again into anonymity. "Thank you for your patience," he said, breaking the silence with a surprisingly sincere tone. Rachel simply nodded, unaware of the impact that moment would have on both of their lives. In the following days, James couldn't shake the image of Rachel from his mind. She was the complete opposite of Isabella in every way. No artifice, no pretensions, entirely honest in her simplicity. While Isabella manipulated situations for her own benefit, Rachel seemed to exist in a parallel reality where hard work and dignity were enough. James began to watch Rachel from a distance, seeing her clean the corridors discreetly, chatting with other employees, always with a humble but firm posture. Something about her intrigued him. It wasn't attraction, it was curiosity. He saw in Rachel something he had lost over the years: authenticity. That's when an idea began to take shape. During a night when he was working alone in his office, James mentally made a list of what he would need to execute his next big move. A narrative shift, a new symbol for his public life. He needed someone like Rachel, unexpected, someone who could shock society and redefine the perception of his image. The next morning, he called her into his office. Rachel entered hesitantly, her hands fidgeting, thinking she would be reprimanded for something. But James was direct. "I have a proposal," he said, crossing his arms. "I want you to pretend to be my wife for a while. It will be an agreement, and you will be well compensated." Rachel's eyes widened in confusion. "I don't understand, Signor Miller. Why me?" she asked, genuinely incredulous. James leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "Because you're everything Isabella never was, and that's exactly what I need." James Miller's decision to organize a symbolic wedding was not just a gesture to seal his agreement with Rachel. It was a meticulously planned move, a carefully orchestrated spectacle to reclaim his position of dominance in USA high society. He didn't just want to get married again. He wanted everyone to see his strength, to understand that he hadn't been defeated. For James, this wedding was more than a social event. It was his declaration of power, a message to those who had dared to doubt him after the scandal with Isabella Smith. Rachel, on the other hand, was completely out of place. Since accepting the agreement, her life had been turned upside down. She was no longer just a cleaning employee, but the fiancée of one of the most influential men in the country. James made sure to introduce her into this world of luxury and expectations from the very first moment. She was taken to exclusive stores, where renowned stylists dressed her in creations she never imagined could exist. Jewelry, shoes, beauty treatments, everything was done to transform Rachel into someone who could move effortlessly through the most demanding social circles. But even surrounded by all this glamour, Rachel felt uncomfortable. She never asked for this, and although she had accepted the agreement out of necessity, she couldn't ignore the feeling of being used. "Don't you think this is excessive?" Rachel asked James during one of her fittings, as she looked at her reflection in a crystal-covered dress. "Excessive is what these people expect, Rachel," he replied, adjusting his tie in front of a mirror. "This wedding isn't about us. It's about what they see." Rachel began to realize that for James, everything was calculated. He didn't talk about feelings or emotional reasons. Everything revolved around strategy. This bothered her, but at the same time, it fascinated her. "And what do you see when you look at me?" she asked in a rare moment of vulnerability. James paused for a moment, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection of the mirror. "I see the chance to turn the game around." The days leading up to the wedding were filled with a mixture of nerves and tension. James controlled every detail of the event with surgical precision. The chosen venue was a historic estate on the outskirts of New York, a setting that blended tradition and sophistication. Rachel was constantly instructed on how to behave, what to say, and how to respond to the inevitable questions about her life before meeting James. Despite her discomfort, she tried her best to play her part in the agreement. Finally, the day of the wedding arrived. The venue was decorated with exotic flowers, crystal chandeliers, and an atmosphere of opulence that impressed even the most accustomed to luxury. Journalists, photographers, and prominent personalities filled the space, all eager to see what James Miller had prepared this time. When Rachel stepped out of the car, in a wedding dress that seemed to float in the wind, all eyes turned to her. It was as though time stood still. Despite her nervous posture, there was something about Rachel, perhaps her authenticity or her quiet resistance, that made her seem genuinely unique. James, for his part, waited for her at the altar with a serious expression that concealed any emotion. He knew this moment was crucial, that everyone present was evaluating every detail. When Rachel finally reached his side, he leaned slightly and whispered, "You're doing a good job. Keep it up." It was a dry compliment, but coming from him, it almost sounded like a gesture of gratitude. The ceremony proceeded perfectly until a murmur began to spread among the guests. At the back of the hall, Isabella Smith had arrived. Impeccably dressed but carrying an expression of defiance, she walked toward the altar. The moment seemed straight out of a movie script. Everyone fell silent. Rachel froze, while James slowly turned to face the woman who just weeks earlier had been the source of his greatest blow. Isabella smiled as if to demonstrate she still had some control over him. "It seems I couldn't resist coming to see this with my own eyes," Isabella said, her voice soft but laden with irony. James didn't hesitate. "And now that you've seen it, you can leave," he replied firmly, without losing his composure. Isabella laughed, but the confidence in her expression faltered. "I thought you'd need more than this to get over what happened between us." James approached her, his eyes fixed on hers. "The difference between us, Isabella, is that you live in the past. Me, I build the future." James's words reverberated through the hall. Isabella, without an answer, was discreetly escorted out by security. Rachel watched it all, torn between admiration for his stance and the feeling that she still didn't fully understand who James Miller truly was. When the ceremony finally ended, James raised a glass for a toast, but his gaze met Rachel's. "Sometimes, the future starts with a well-told lie," he said softly before taking a drink. Rachel didn't respond, but something in that moment made it clear that James's plan was far from simple. Rachel Davis's move into James Miller's mansion happened on a grey morning, with heavy clouds covering the skies of New York. She arrived with a small suitcase in hand, trying to ignore the sense of inadequacy that seemed to cling to every step she took. The property was colossal, with gardens that seemed to stretch to the horizon and modern architecture that exuded power and sophistication. Every detail, from the automatic gates to the immense glass windows, whispered that she didn't belong in that place. James greeted her briefly, indicating that one of the staff would accompany her to the designated room. "Don't worry, Rachel. No one will interfere with your routine here, as long as you don't interfere with mine," he said in the direct, impersonal tone that had become his trademark. She simply nodded, trying to hide her discomfort. The room reserved for her was bigger than any space Rachel had ever had to herself. The bed, with its pristine white sheets, looked more like a throne than a place to sleep. But as impressive as it was, the coldness of the room unsettled her. There was nothing there that suggested life or warmth, just impeccable design and suffocating perfection. Rachel spent the first few days trying to adapt, but the feeling of displacement was constant. The staff at the house were overly formal, and James seemed more like a ghost, appearing only to give instructions or to adjust the details of his plan. The differences between the two began to appear almost immediately. Rachel, with her simple and direct nature, clashed with James's controlling rigidity. One of the first arguments happened at breakfast, when Rachel dared to prepare a typical USA dish for herself. James entered the kitchen, and as soon as he smelled the fried tortillas, he raised an eyebrow. "This isn't something that would fit with this environment. The chef prepares a balanced menu. You don't need to improvise," he said, without even looking at the plate. Rachel responded without hesitation, "I don't need a chef to tell me what I like to eat. If it bothers you, I can make it at my old house." Her firm tone surprised him. Few people dared to challenge him, let alone someone like Rachel. These small clashes became frequent. Rachel hated how James seemed obsessed with control, while he found it difficult to deal with her spontaneity. But paradoxically, it was these moments of tension that began to build a bridge between the two. One day, while James was working in his private library, he heard a soft melody coming from the floor below. He went down to discover Rachel playing an old guitar she had found forgotten in one of the rooms. The sound was delicate, but carried an emotional depth that made him stop on the stairs, listening to her without her noticing. "I didn't know you played," he commented when the music ended, causing Rachel to startle. "I used to play when I was younger, but I never had time to continue," she replied, putting the guitar aside as if it was something unimportant. James, however, couldn't take his eyes off her. For the first time, he saw a side of her that went beyond humility and simplicity. There was passion and sadness in that music, something that intrigued him deeply. As the weeks went by, the interactions between the two began to change. James became more interested in details about Rachel's life that he had previously ignored. She, in turn, began to see beyond the cold and calculating facade he put on. On one particularly quiet night, the two of them ended up sharing a glass of wine in the living room. Rachel told stories from her childhood about how her mother used to sing while doing laundry and how she learned to fight against adversity with a smile on her face. James, who rarely shared anything personal, let slip a small detail from his youth in Brooklyn, something he normally avoided mentioning. These sincere moments created cracks in the barrier they had both built. What started as a business arrangement began to show signs of becoming something more genuine. The relationship between James and Rachel, already fragile, was thrown into a storm when the first rumors began to circulate. It was a morning like any other, and Rachel was having coffee in the kitchen of the mansion when James's phone started vibrating incessantly. He answered, his face immediately hardening. A well-known journalist had just published an article insinuating that James Miller's marriage to Rachel Davis was a sham, possibly a marketing move to recover his reputation, which had been shaken by the scandal with Isabella Smith. Rachel, unaware of anything, noticed the tension on James's face when he entered the kitchen. "What happened?" she asked, concerned. James hesitated for a moment, as though deciding whether he should tell her. Finally, he pushed a tablet in her direction, showing the article. The headline was cruel. "The Tycoon's Farce, the Convenience Marriage, James Miller doesn't want you to discover." Rachel read the words silently, but her expression showed the impact. "Is this serious?" she murmured, her voice trembling. While James tried to maintain his composure, Rachel began to grasp the gravity of the situation. The rumors weren't just about him, they were about her too. Isabella, though out of the spotlight since the wedding, had apparently found a way to retaliate. Using contacts in the press, she planted the story that Rachel was an opportunist who had manipulated James to gain wealth and status. The insinuations were cruel, painting her as a woman without morals, someone who had no place beside a man like James. The pressure came fast. Journalists began to surround the entrance of the mansion, trying to get any statement. Rachel, who had never been exposed to this level of attention, was scared. No matter what she did, every movement was interpreted as a confirmation of the rumors. On social media, people called her a scammer, imposter, and worse. She couldn't leave the house without being followed by cameras and invasive questions. "How do you live like this?" Rachel asked James one night, visibly exhausted. "You said I only needed to play my part in this agreement, but you never mentioned that I'd be publicly humiliated." The conflict between them, which had been brewing, finally exploded. James, focused on protecting his image and trying to minimize the damage, seemed indifferent to Rachel's suffering. To him, this was just another obstacle to be overcome, something that could be solved with strategies and control. But Rachel couldn't accept this attitude. "You don't get it, James. I'm a human being, not an accessory in your revenge plan," she yelled at him during a heated argument in the living room. James, who rarely lost his cool, responded coldly. "You knew what you were getting into. You accepted the agreement. Now fulfill your part." His words cut deep, but they also left him uneasy. For the first time, James began to realize the true impact of his actions on Rachel. He watched her from afar as she avoided eye contact with the staff or spent hours locked in her room. She was clearly shaken, but still maintained her dignity, something he couldn't ignore. James realized that, despite his apparent strength, he had underestimated just how much this situation weighed on her. The way Rachel handled the pressure made him reflect on his own coldness and arrogance. Meanwhile, Isabella was not satisfied. Determined to completely destroy the marriage and destabilize James, she hired a private detective. Isabella believed that if she could uncover something about Rachel's past, she could use it to further discredit her. She wanted a story that would reinforce her narrative that Rachel was nothing but a gold digger. Driven by resentment, Isabella was willing to play dirty, even though she knew this would expose just how far she would go to hurt James. Rachel, for her part, began to question whether she had made the right decision by accepting the agreement. Each new attack felt more personal, and she felt increasingly alone. However, there was something inside her that refused to give up. When James started to soften his approach, trying to offer support, Rachel made it clear, "If you want me to keep going with this, then start respecting me. I'm not just part of your plan, James. I'm a person." Her words were a turning point. For the first time, James found himself forced to reconsider his approach. He began to see that if he wanted to continue with the plan, he needed to not only protect Rachel from the media attacks, but also treat her as a true partner. The nights in James Miller's mansion were usually quiet, interrupted only by the sound of the wind passing through the gardens. But on this particular night, something was different. Rachel was sitting on the porch of the room they had assigned her, staring at the vast sky. The past few days had been exhausting. She felt the weight of the judgments, the rumors, and the constant pressure that came with the arrangement. Despite her strength, there were moments when she felt like she was on the verge of collapsing. James passed by the hallway and noticed the light still on in her room. On impulse, he stopped at the door. She looked so small sitting there, lost in her thoughts. Without asking for permission, he entered. Rachel jumped when she heard his voice. "Can't sleep?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral, but with a hint of genuine curiosity. She sighed, too tired to be concerned about his presence. "It's not so easy to turn off your mind when you feel like you're in the middle of a war." James sat down in the nearby chair, something he never did. Sharing informal moments was not his style. For a few minutes, neither of them said anything. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Then Rachel broke the barrier. "You know what's funny, James? People like you would never understand where I come from. You don't know what it means to fight to survive every single day." He stared at her, intrigued but didn't interrupt. For the first time, she seemed willing to reveal a little of who she was. "I grew up in Chicago, in a little house so small that when it rained, it felt like we were outside. My parents were farmers, simple people but honest. We never had enough money for everything, and many times we had to choose between eating or fixing the roof. When I was 7, my father died in a work accident. He was trying to fix a machine on the farm where he worked and, well, he never came home." Rachel paused, her eyes fixed on the ground, reliving memories that never quite went away. James stayed silent, but something in his expression changed. It was as though he was absorbing every word, processing. "After that, my mother took over everything. She worked as a housekeeper, a laundry woman, whatever she needed to do to put food on the table. I started helping early. I dropped out of school to work with her, but even then it was never enough. When I was 14, she got sick. Cancer. It was too quick. I was left alone. No one wanted to care for a teenager with no money and no prospects. So I came to New York." Her voice was firm, but there was a weight to every word. James felt something different in that moment, a connection he hadn't expected. For the first time, he saw the real Rachel, not just the simple woman he had turned into a pawn in his plan. "And how did you survive?" he asked, lowering his voice, almost afraid to interrupt the flow of her words. "I did what I could. I worked as a waitress, a cleaner, even sold flowers on the streets. It was never easy, but I knew quitting wasn't an option. My mother always said, the world doesn't give you anything, you have to take it. So, that's what I did." James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He found himself reflecting on Rachel in a way he never had before. Although they came from such different worlds, he understood the struggle, the effort to overcome adversity. "You're not anything like I thought you were, Rachel," he admitted, breaking the barrier he had always kept between them. She looked at him seriously. "And what exactly did you think I was, James? A puppet? A disposable piece in your revenge game?" He didn't answer immediately. For the first time, he didn't have a calculated response. "Maybe I underestimated you," he confessed, his tone more honest than he had expected. "But now I see that you're much more than that, more than anyone here realizes." Rachel didn't respond, but something in her eyes softened. For the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, James saw her as more than just a deal. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was almost comforting, a kind of truce. James, driven by something he couldn't identify, made a promise that surprised even him. "No one will use your past against you, Rachel. If Isabella tries, I'll make sure she won't succeed. You have my word." That exchange of stories that night created an unexpected bond between them. The space of distrust began to give way to something more solid. Rachel still had her doubts, but for the first time, she didn't feel alone. And James, who had always seen everything as a strategy game, realized that his relationship with Rachel was becoming something he couldn't control, something real. That night on the porch marked a subtle yet deep shift in the relationship between James and Rachel. From that moment on, their interactions began to take on a different tone. James started paying more attention to Rachel, not just as the key player in his plan, but as a person who carried a quiet strength, something he, despite his success, had never fully managed to achieve. The way she naturally faced challenges, even when she seemed on the verge of falling apart, awakened an admiration in him that he didn't know how to handle. However, it wasn't just the grand gestures or the words that built this new dynamic. Small moments began to emerge between them. On a calm afternoon, James found Rachel in the kitchen, something rare for him. She was laughing with the staff, preparing a simple dish she had learned in her childhood. He stood still for a moment, watching her with curiosity. "You never stop, do you?" he said, interrupting the moment. She looked up, still smiling. "You should try doing something with your hands, James. It's good for clearing your mind." He scoffed at the suggestion, but somehow found himself helping Rachel chop vegetables. They both laughed at his complete lack of skill, and for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: lightness. Rachel had the gift of challenging the barriers he had built throughout his life, making him reconsider not only his actions, but also the way he viewed the world. The days turned into weeks, and those small moments became more frequent. James, once a man of direct and calculated words, started seeking Rachel's company during moments of relaxation. The heated discussions that once marked their coexistence gave way to sincere conversations and unexpected laughter. On one of those nights, as they walked through the mansion's gardens, Rachel, unknowingly, provoked James into sharing more about his childhood. He, hesitant at first, ended up revealing how his obsession with control came from the constant fear of losing everything he had built. "Sometimes it feels like you carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, James," Rachel said, looking at him with a compassion that disarmed him. "Maybe it's time to learn that you don't have to control everything for things to work." Her words left him thoughtful. Rachel didn't just challenge him, she made him see possibilities he had never considered before. It was on one particularly quiet night, after a more relaxed dinner, that James finally gave in to an impulse he had been ignoring. They were in the living room, talking about trivial things, when James, suddenly serious, looked away for a moment, as if fighting with himself before finally speaking. "Rachel, I need to admit something. I don't know when it happened, but you've become more than just part of this plan for me." Rachel froze, surprised by the confession. James never showed vulnerability, and hearing that from him left her speechless. I don't know what to say," she replied softly. He let out a small, almost nervous laugh. "Neither do I. I just wanted you to know." The days that followed were marked by a different kind of tension, but it wasn't unpleasant. Rachel began to notice changes in her own way of looking at James. The man she had initially despised for his coldness now showed nuances she hadn't expected. Small gestures, like seeking her company or asking about her day, made her wonder if she herself was beginning to open her heart to him. This frightened her. She knew that this marriage was a facade, a temporary arrangement. But what if it could change? As they navigated this new reality, the moments of relaxation continued to emerge, revealing a compatibility that once seemed impossible. One afternoon, as they were together tidying up a forgotten room in the mansion, Rachel began to hum a melody from her childhood. James, who had already heard about her musical talent, encouraged her to sing louder. What started as a playful moment ended up becoming one of significance, with James admitting that her voice made him forget the weight of his routine. For the first time, they began to consider the possibility that what they were building didn't have to remain just a facade. They didn't say it aloud, but it was clear that both of them felt something genuine was forming. The weeks that followed the growing closeness between James and Rachel brought a lighter routine to the mansion. Arguments diminished, and small gestures of care appeared in their daily life. But Rachel, although visibly more comfortable by James's side, began to notice something different. Her body was giving signals she couldn't ignore. She felt more tired than usual, had frequent nausea, and a constant discomfort that wasn't just caused by the pressure of the agreement or the rumors in the media. At first, she attributed it all to stress. But after fainting during a conversation with the staff, she decided it was time to investigate. It was at a modest clinic, far from the upscale area where she lived, that Rachel received the news that would change her life. Pregnant. The doctor's words echoed in her mind as she tried to process the information. The ground seemed to disappear beneath her feet. On one hand, there was fear. The agreement with James was temporary, and a baby had never been part of the plan. But on the other hand, something unexpected took hold of her: joy. It was impossible not to think that despite all the difficulties, the life growing inside her was a gift. She felt a tear run down her face as she held the ultrasound in her hands. For the first time in years, she thought of her mother and how she would have reacted to the news. When Rachel returned to the mansion that night, she couldn't hide the whirlwind of emotions. James immediately noticed something was off. He was in the living room, reviewing documents, but stopped when he saw her enter. "You look different. Did something happen?" he asked, putting the papers aside. Rachel hesitated. It was rare to see him concerned, and this made her even more nervous. "We need to talk, James," she said, sitting down in one of the armchairs. Her voice was serious, but also trembling. He furrowed his brow, concerned. "What's wrong? Is it about the rumors? Did someone bother you?" Rachel shook her head. "It's not that. It's personal." There was a heavy silence between them before she took a deep breath and blurted out, "I'm pregnant, James. It's yours." Shock took over his face. James Miller, known for his unshakable calm, was speechless. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He stood up, walked to the window, and processed the information. For a man who had always controlled every aspect of his life, This news was like an earthquake. A child had never been part of his plans. In that moment, he felt the barrier he had built around himself threatened. Rachel, on the other hand, felt his silence like a knife. "I know this complicates everything," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "But you need to know that no matter what, I will raise this child. I don't expect anything from you." Her words made him turn around immediately. "You think I'm going to abandon my child?" he asked, offended. "No, Rachel, that's not who I am." Despite the determination in his voice, James was conflicted. He would spend the night awake in his library, trying to understand how the news of being a father affected him so deeply. It was a feeling that went beyond the fear of the unknown. It was as if, for the first time, he had a chance to build something that didn't depend on appearances or manipulations. A child. Someone who would depend on him, not for the power he had, but for the man he was. The next day, James went to Rachel. He found her in the garden, staring at the flowers with a distant expression. He paused for a moment before approaching. "I still don't know how I'm going to deal with this," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "But what I do know is that I will be by your side, Rachel. You're not alone, and our child won't be either." Rachel looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his words. In that moment, she saw a man who genuinely seemed willing to change. Even with the fear she still felt, she couldn't help but offer a small smile. "I don't know if I can trust you, James, but thank you." It was a start, even if uncertain. The news of Rachel's pregnancy leaked before she and James had a chance to fully process what it meant for them. It all started with a photo taken without permission, capturing Rachel leaving a medical clinic accompanied by one of the mansion's security guards. The image was enough to fuel the media's imagination. Within hours, tabloids and gossip programs were ablaze, speculating about this new phase in James Miller's life and the woman who everyone still saw as an intruder in his world. The headlines were cruel. "Planned pregnancy or calculated scam," one read. Another, even more offensive, questioned whether the baby was truly James's, insinuating that Rachel had a questionable past. For Rachel, each news article was like a blow. Even within the mansion, where the presence of journalists and paparazzi had become constant, she felt the eyes of the world on her, judging every decision, every expression. "I don't know how you can stand living like this," she confided to James one night as she read one of the articles. "I never wanted this, James. I don't want our child to grow up surrounded by this toxicity." James listened to her in silence, but his expression hardened. He knew the weight the rumors had on Rachel, and it enraged him. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he needed to act not just for himself, but for someone else. "They have no right to treat you like this," he said, his voice firm. "If they want to attack me, fine, but you and our child are off limits." The next day, James called a press conference at his mansion, something rare for him, as he preferred to deal with the media from a distance. He appeared alongside Rachel, holding her hand, something that immediately caught the attention of the journalists present. His posture was imposing, but his tone carried a sincerity that few expected. "Yes, Rachel is pregnant, and I am the father," he began, looking directly into the cameras. "I want to make it clear that my family is off limits for speculation. Any attempt to tarnish her name will be treated as a personal attack, and I will not hesitate to take legal action." He paused, gently squeezing Rachel's hand. "You may call me cold or calculating, but never doubt what I'm saying now. Rachel is my wife, and she will be the mother of my child, and I will do everything to protect them." James's words had an immediate impact. While some journalists still insisted on fueling the rumors, many began to see the situation in a different light. James's image, always so controlled, appeared more human in that moment, And Rachel, once portrayed as an opportunist, began to be seen in a new light. For her, James's gesture was more than just a public defense. It was the first time she felt that he was truly on her side, not just as part of an agreement, but as someone who genuinely cared. Over time, Rachel began to grow stronger. Although she still felt the external pressure, she knew she wasn't alone. This encouraged her to face the challenges with more confidence, especially as she realized that the baby she was carrying was her absolute priority. James, for his part, began to become more actively involved in the preparations. The baby's room became a project the two shared, something that brought them unexpected moments of intimacy. One weekend, they spent hours choosing colors for the room. "I didn't know you had such basic taste," Rachel teased James as he suggested neutral tones for the walls. He laughed, something rare but genuine. "I just want it to be a peaceful space, but if you insist, you can pick whatever you want." Rachel rolled her eyes but smiled. "It's good to see you know how to give in." These small interactions, so simple, began to create a foundation of affection and respect that once seemed impossible. As they put the crib together, James paused and looked at Rachel. "Did you know it would be like this?" he asked softly. Rachel stopped for a moment, looking at him. "No, but I think some things just happen the way they need to happen." He nodded, as if that answer was enough. The bond between the two grew stronger with each passing day. The envelope arrived at James's mansion on a quiet morning, along with other routine documents and mail. However, its simple appearance contrasted with the impact of its contents. Rachel, who was sitting in the living room going through a catalogue of items for the baby, noticed the sudden silence from James as he opened the letter. He read quickly, but the tension on his face was evident. Without saying anything, he placed the paper on the table and stepped away, as if he needed space to process what he had just read. Rachel observed the scene with curiosity and a slight concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. James hesitated before responding. "It's from Isabella," he finally said, almost as if saying her name was something he would rather avoid. "She wants to meet. She says she needs closure." But the last word was heavy with irony, and James gave a bitter smile. Rachel remained silent for a moment, considering. "What are you going to do?" she asked, studying his reaction. "I don't know," James replied, crossing his arms and looking out the window. "Part of me wants to ignore it, move on, but another part, I don't know if I can just leave it behind without facing it head on." He sighed, running his hands through his hair, a rare sign of vulnerability. That's when Rachel, with a maturity that surprised him, shared her thoughts. "You should go," she said. James looked at her, confused. "Why? She's already caused enough damage. I don't want to open up space for more of this." Rachel approached him, crossing her arms just like he had. "I understand, but sometimes what we need to move forward isn't to ignore the past, but to face it head on. This isn't about her, James. It's about you." Her words resonated more than he would admit. Reluctantly but convinced, James decided to accept Isabella's request. He arranged to meet her in the afternoon at a discreet hotel cafe, away from the eyes of the media. When he arrived, Isabella was already waiting. She was impeccably dressed, as always, but there was something different in her expression, a vulnerability he hadn't recognized in her before. "James," she said, standing up as he approached. Her tone was hesitant, almost shy, something he had never associated with her. "Thank you for coming." He nodded, sitting down without saying a word. For a moment they both sat in silence, as if they didn't know where to start. It was Isabella who took the initiative. "I know you probably don't want to hear anything I have to say," she began, nervously fiddling with the napkin on the table. "But I needed to try. I needed to explain." James listened in silence as she spoke about her mistakes. Isabella tried to justify her betrayal, saying that at the time she had been lost, insecure, and that their relationship had become more of an obligation than a partnership. "I know I hurt you, and looking back, I regret every decision I made," she said, her voice choked. "But I still care about you, James. I know I ruined everything, but is there any chance for us?" Her words hung in the air, but James remained calm, firm. He took a deep breath before responding. "Isabella, for a long time, I wondered what I could have done differently. If I was the one who was wrong, if I could have avoided what happened. But today, I see that it wasn't just about me. You made your choices, and I moved on. Now, my life isn't about what's left behind." He paused, looking directly into her eyes. "My life now is about Rachel and our child, and as much as I wish for you to find peace, Isabella, there is no place for you in my future." Isabella tried to hide the impact of his words, but her eyes betrayed her pain. She smiled weakly, realizing that James wasn't just determined, but at peace with his decision. "I understand," she said quietly. "I just wanted to undo what I did. But if you're happy, I think it's time for me to let you go." When James returned to the mansion, Rachel was in the garden, watering the plants. He watched her for a moment before approaching. Without her needing to ask, he said, "It's over. Isabella and I have closed what was left unfinished." Rachel looked at him, surprised by the clarity in his voice. "And how do you feel?" she asked. James gave a small smile, something more honest than usual. "Free." The first contractions started on a quiet night. Rachel woke up with a deep pain that made her sit up in bed, breathing heavily. The room was dimly lit, and for a moment she thought it was just another discomfort common to the end of pregnancy. But when the second wave of pain came, stronger and more intense, she realized that the time had come. "James," she called, trying to keep calm. "James, it's time." He, who had been sleeping in a nearby room, appeared at the door within seconds, visibly alarmed. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" he asked, but as soon as he saw Rachel holding her belly, he needed no explanation. James quickly grabbed the bag they had prepared weeks before and helped Rachel down the stairs with care. His steps were firm, but his expression revealed the tension of the moment. "Breathe, Rachel. We're almost there," he said as he placed her in the car and sped through the almost deserted streets of New York. At the hospital, Rachel was immediately taken to the delivery room, and James stayed by her side, holding her hand. The hours that followed were long and exhausting. Rachel alternated between groaning in pain and moments of deep silence as she focused all her energy. James, who had always been the unshakable pillar in any situation, now seemed vulnerable, torn between concern for Rachel and the anticipation of Ethan's arrival. When the first cry of the baby echoed in the room, an overwhelming wave of emotion filled the space. James, who rarely showed weakness, felt his eyes well up as he saw Ethan for the first time. The tiny being in his arms was fragile, yet carried an immeasurable weight of significance. "It's our son," he murmured, looking at Rachel with pure admiration. Rachel, exhausted, smiled slightly, tears streaming down her face. "He's perfect," she whispered, before closing her eyes for a brief moment of rest. Holding Ethan in his arms, James felt something he had never experienced before. All the control he had always sought in his life seemed irrelevant in the face of this small miracle. He realized that his obsession with success, with perfection, had been replaced by a new priority, being a present father and a true companion. In that moment, he decided he would do everything to protect his new family. The following days were marked by a series of adjustments. Rachel, despite her exhaustion, showed a natural ability to care for the baby. James, on the other hand, was out of his comfort zone. Changing diapers, calming Ethan's cries, and understanding his feeding schedule were challenges he had never imagined facing. But with patience and determination, he began to learn. Rachel watched, sometimes with a smile, as James, still in his impeccable suits, held Ethan with a mix of insecurity and tenderness. "You're doing well," she said one evening as she watched him rock the baby to sleep. The mansion, once silent and cold, transformed into a home full of life. The halls echoed with the sounds of laughter, crying, and the hurried steps of the staff helping with Ethan's care. James, who used to spend hours in the office, began to delegate more responsibilities in the company so he could spend time with his family. He discovered that the moments with Ethan and Rachel were more valuable than any negotiation or fashion show. Rachel, for her part, began to find her place in this new life. Despite the pressure of still being seen by many as the woman who didn't belong in this world, she became more confident. The strength she had developed over the years now shone in every gesture, especially when she held Ethan in her arms or faced with serenity the occasional criticism that still surfaced. The partnership between James and Rachel also evolved. They began to act as a real team, sharing responsibilities and moments that had once seemed impossible. During one night when they finally managed to have dinner together after putting Ethan to bed, James took Rachel's hand and said, "I never imagined I'd come to this point, but you two are everything to me." Rachel, surprised, smiled genuinely. "I didn't expect any of this either, but I think the unexpected has been the best part of it all." Their relationship, once built on an agreement, was now becoming genuine. The mutual respect was turning into something deeper, and the arrival of Ethan solidified the idea that they were no longer just pretending to be a family. They truly were one. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the curtains of the mansion, softly illuminating the room where James, Rachel, and Ethan were gathered. The bed, which had once seemed large and cold, now felt like a warm space. Ethan, only a few months old, lay between them, babbling sounds that made Rachel laugh while James watched, enchanted. The scene, so simple, was something he had never imagined for himself. For the first time in years, he felt like he didn't need to rush to work or respond to urgent messages. Everything that mattered was right there, within arm's reach. After Ethan's birth, James began to realize that his obsession with control and perfection no longer made sense. He still managed Casa Miller, but now with different priorities. Meetings that once consumed the entire day were reduced, business trips were delegated to trusted partners, and entire afternoons were reserved for being with Rachel and Ethan. "I realized I don't need to control everything," he confessed to Rachel one night as he rocked Ethan in his arms. "The world won't collapse if I slow down. In fact, I think I was collapsing because I never stopped." Rachel smiled, gently touching his arm. "You've finally realized there's more to life than work." Rachel, too, had changed significantly. The woman who had arrived timid and out of place in the mansion now walked with confidence, facing the challenges that came her way. She began attending events alongside James, confronting the elite who had once looked down on her. Although there were still critical stares, many began to see her as an example of authenticity and resilience. Rachel also found her voice to advocate for other women who, like her, had faced hardships. It was during one of these events that an idea began to take shape. "I want to do something that goes beyond us," Rachel said to James one night as they talked in the mansion's garden. "There are so many women who go through what I went through: poverty, loneliness, closed doors. I want to help them find a way forward." James, surprised by her determination, remained silent for a moment before smiling. "You're right. I think we can do something meaningful together. Maybe it's time for Casa Miller to mean more than just fashion." And so, the idea for a social project was born, one that would offer job opportunities and training for women in vulnerable situations. The initiative was named Fundación Renaka, a name suggested by James, symbolizing a new beginning. As they worked together on the project, James and Rachel began to recognize the impact they had on each other. In a rare moment of vulnerability, James thanked Rachel. "You've transformed my life, Rachel. Before you, I thought I had everything, but I was empty. You and Ethan have brought a purpose I never imagined having." Rachel, moved, took his hand. "And you gave me something I never thought I could have. Security. Not just material, but emotional. You've shown me that I don't have to carry everything alone." As time passed, the mansion completely transformed. Once a space of cold luxury, it was now a home full of life. Ethan grew up surrounded by love, while James and Rachel discovered each other in a relationship built on respect and collaboration. During the simpler moments, like impromptu dinners or walks in the garden, they realized that true happiness lay in those small fragments of normalcy. One particularly peaceful morning, the three of them were in the mansion's yard. Ethan, now older, was crawling around the garden while Rachel and James watched him. James sat on the grass, something he would never have done before Ethan was born, holding a camera and taking pictures of every movement of their son. Rachel laughed as she saw him so dedicated. "You've turned into a total cliché dad," she joked. He looked at her with a smile that mixed amusement and love. "And I couldn't be happier about it." While Ethan played, James took Rachel's hand. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, looking at her seriously. "But I know I want to build that future with you and Ethan." Rachel squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with restrained tears. "We're already building it, James. And I think we're doing really well."